The piercing scream echoed through the dusty auction yard as Virginia Edwards doubled over, clutching her swollen belly with trembling hands. The pain that had started as a dull ache in the pre-dawn hours had transformed into something monstrous, something that tore through her body with the ferocity of a summer storm. Yet here she stood on a wooden platform in Nevada City, California, 1876, being auctioned off like cattle to pay her late husband's gambling debts. Folks, what we have here is a fine woman, still young at 22, knows how to cook, clean, and mind children. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd of men who had gathered in the midday heat. Most were miners or ranch hands looking for a woman to tend their homes, and Virginia knew their intentions were far from honorable. Starting bid is $30. Virginia bit back another scream as a contraction rippled through her. Her long chestnut hair, once her pride, hung in dirty tangles around her face. 3 days she had been held in the auction yards holding pen. 3 days since Sheriff Yates had dragged her from her small home, informing her that, according to the law, she was responsible for her husband's debts. 3 days without proper food or water, and now her baby was coming. $40, called a gruff voice from the crowd. Virginia recognized him as Jeb Walker, the owner of the saloon where her husband had lost their life savings before dying in a bar fight 2 months ago. His yellowed teeth gleamed as he grinned up at her. "We have 40. Do I hear 45? 50? Another man raised his hand, a portly miner with blackened fingernails and a cruel twist to his mouth. Virginia clutched the wooden post beside her, the world swimming before her eyes. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when her baby was fighting to enter this cruel world. "Please," she whispered, though no one seemed to hear her plea. $75. The new voice was different, clear, strong, and coming from the back of the crowd. The crowd parted as a tall figure strode forward. Virginia blinked through her tears to see a man unlike the others pushing his way toward the platform. His broad shoulders were draped in a long duster coat, dusty from the trail, but of fine quality. The black Stetson hat shadowed his face, but she could see the firm set of his jaw and the intensity in his blue eyes as he approached. "We have 75 from Mr. Sullivan Kent. Do I hear 80? The auctioneer's excitement was palpable as he recognized the newcomer, one of the most successful cattle ranchers in the territory. $100, countered Walker, his face contorting with anger. The tall stranger didn't even look in Walker's direction. 200, he said calmly, his eyes fixed on Virginia. A hush fell over the crowd. $200 was an extravagant sum, more than most of these men made in months of hard labor. Virginia's knees buckled as another contraction hit, stronger than before. She couldn't hold back the cry that escaped her lips, and she saw the stranger's expression change from determination to fury. Before the auctioneer could respond, the man called Sullivan Kent was mounting the steps to the platform in 2 long strides. "This ends now," he declared, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent yard. The auctioneer stepped back, uncertain. "Sir, the auction isn't $200. Sullivan pulled a leather pouch from his coat and tossed it at the auctioneer's feet. Gold coins spilled onto the wooden planks. "That should cover whatever debts this woman supposedly owes." Without waiting for a response, he removed his duster and wrapped it around Virginia's trembling shoulders. Then, with surprising gentleness for such a large man, he lifted her into his arms. Virginia gasped, both from pain and surprise. "What are you doing?" she managed through clenched teeth. His blue eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw something there that looked remarkably like compassion. "Getting you both out of here," he said quietly. "You can't just take her." Walker protested, stepping forward. "The auction isn't finished." Sullivan turned, Virginia cradled against his chest, and faced the crowd. "This woman is in labor," he announced, his voice resonating with controlled anger. "And you vultures would bid on her like she's nothing more than property." His gaze swept over the uncomfortable faces below. "Both of you deserve better," he said, looking down at Virginia before addressing the crowd again. "I've paid more than enough. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me at my ranch." The mention of his ranch seemed to quell any further objections. Sullivan Kent's reputation preceded him a fair man, but not one to be crossed. Without another word, he carried Virginia down the steps and through the parting crowd. "My horse is at the hitching post," he told her, his voice softer now that they were away from the auction yard. "I'm going to get you to a doctor." Virginia clutched at his shirt as another contraction came. "There's no time," she gasped. "The baby's coming now." Concern flashed across his face, but his steps didn't falter as he changed direction, heading instead toward a small building at the edge of town. "The midwife lives there," he explained. "She helped deliver my sister's children." Virginia didn't have the strength to question how this stranger knew the local midwife, or why he had intervened in her auction. All she knew was that for the first time in months, since her husband's death had left her alone and destitute, someone was helping her. Sullivan Kent kicked at the door of the modest cabin, and it swung open to reveal an older woman with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes widened at the sight before her. "Mrs. Fletcher, this woman needs your help," Sullivan said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Her baby's coming." The midwife didn't waste time asking questions. "Bring her in and lay her on the bed," she instructed, already rolling up her sleeves. Sullivan carried Virginia to the small bed in the corner of the one-room cabin and gently laid her down. As he started to step away, Virginia grabbed his hand, fear making her bold. "Don't leave," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Please, I don't want to be alone." Something flickered in Sullivan's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or conflict. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded and pulled up a chair beside the bed, keeping her hand in his. "I won't leave," he promised softly. And so Virginia Edwards, a widow being auctioned to pay her dead husband's debts, found herself giving birth while holding the hand of a stranger who had just paid $200 for her freedom. Mrs. Fletcher moved efficiently around the small space, gathering clean cloths and heating water. "This baby's in a hurry," she commented as she checked Virginia. "Won't be long now." Virginia's labor progressed rapidly, her body seemingly determined to bring her child into the world now that she was safe. Through it all, Sullivan Kent remained by her side, his large hand engulfing hers, offering silent support as she fought through the pain. When the cabin finally echoed with the lusty cries of a newborn, Virginia collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but filled with a fierce joy she hadn't thought possible amid so much despair. "You have a son, Mrs. Fletcher announced, cleaning and wrapping the tiny red-faced infant before placing him in Virginia's trembling arms. Virginia stared down at her baby's face, perfect despite the ordeal of his birth. Tiny fingers curled against her skin as tears of relief and love spilled down her cheeks. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm so sorry about the circumstances of your arrival." Sullivan Kent had released her hand when the midwife placed the baby in her arms, but he remained seated beside the bed, watching the interaction with an unreadable expression. "What will you name him?" he asked quietly. Virginia looked up, almost surprised to find him still there. For a moment she hesitated, thinking of the husband who had gambled away their future and left her in this desperate situation. "Thomas," she finally said, "after my father. He was a good man." Unlike her husband, she didn't add, Sullivan nodded as if approving her choice. Thomas, he repeated. A strong name. Mrs. Fletcher bustled around them, cleaning up and bringing Virginia a cup of strengthening tea. The boy looks healthy, she said approvingly, but you both need rest. What are your plans, Mr. Kent? The question seemed to bring Sullivan back to the reality of their situation. He stood, his tall frame making the small cabin seem even smaller. I've paid Mrs. Edwards' debts. She's free to go wherever she wishes. Virginia looked up at him, sudden fear gripping her heart. Where would she go? Her home had been seized to pay the debts. She had no family left, no money, and now a newborn to care for. As if reading her thoughts, Sullivan continued, "But I have a proposition if you're willing to hear it." Virginia nodded, clutching her son closer. "I have a large ranch about a day's ride from here. My sister Emily lives there with me, but she's expecting her third child and could use help with the household. I'm offering you a position as her companion and helper." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You'll have your own cabin, food, and a small wage. Your son will be safe there." Virginia stared at him, trying to understand. "Why would you do this? You don't know me." Sullivan's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "Let's just say I've seen enough injustice in this world. What happened to you today was wrong." He hesitated. "Besides, Emily would have my hide if she knew I left a new mother and her baby with nowhere to go." Mrs. Fletcher snorted softly. "That she would. Emily Kent has a heart bigger than the whole state of California." Virginia looked down at her son, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. What choice did she really have? "Thank you, Mr. Kent. I accept your offer." Sullivan nodded once, as if the matter was settled. "Rest today and tonight. We'll leave for the ranch tomorrow morning if Mrs. Fletcher thinks you and the boy are strong enough." The midwife nodded. "She's young and healthy. A day's ride shouldn't be too difficult if they travel in your wagon rather than on horseback." "I'll make the arrangements," Sullivan said. He reached into his pocket and placed several coins on the small table. "For your services, Mrs. Fletcher. I'll return in the morning." With that, he settled his hat back on his head and strode out of the cabin, leaving Virginia to wonder what twist of fate had brought this enigmatic rancher to that auction yard at precisely the moment when she needed saving. The morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine autumn day that made the harshness of the frontier seem like a distant concern. Virginia sat on the edge of Mrs. Fletcher's bed, cradling Thomas against her chest as she watched the midwife pack a small bundle of supplies. "Clean cloths for the baby, some healing herbs for you, and bread and cheese for the journey," the older woman explained, tying the bundle with a piece of twine. "Sullivan Kent is a good man despite that hard exterior. His ranch is one of the finest in these parts." Virginia nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "I still don't understand why he helped me." Mrs. Fletcher's expression softened. "Sullivan has his reasons. It's not my place to share his story, but know that he understands what it means to be at the mercy of others." She paused, her weathered hand stilling on the bundle. "His sister Emily will welcome you. She's been wanting female company at that ranch for years." Before Virginia could ask more questions, the sound of wagon wheels outside announced Sullivan's arrival. Mrs. Fletcher helped her to her feet, supporting her as she was still weak from childbirth. "Remember to rest when you can," the midwife instructed. "And feed that boy whenever he fusses. Nature knows best." Virginia thanked the kind woman who had helped bring her son safely into the world, then stepped outside into the morning sunshine. Sullivan Kent stood beside a wagon, holding the reins of two strong horses. He had exchanged yesterday's trail dusty clothes for clean ones, a blue cotton shirt that matched his eyes, dark trousers, and the same black Stetson. "Mrs. Edwards," he greeted her with a slight tip of his hat. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Better, thank you," Virginia replied, though in truth she felt as if she might collapse at any moment. Pride kept her standing straight, her son clutched protectively to her chest. Sullivan seemed to see through her brave front. Without comment, he stepped forward and took the bundle from Mrs. Fletcher, then extended his other arm to Virginia. "Let me help you into the wagon. I've made a comfortable place for you and the boy." The wagon bed had been transformed with blankets and pillows into a makeshift bed. Virginia allowed Sullivan to assist her up, grateful for his strong arm as her legs threatened to give way. Once settled among the blankets, she arranged Thomas more comfortably in her arms. Sullivan nodded in approval. "I've packed supplies for the journey. We should reach the ranch by nightfall if we maintain a steady pace." He handed her a canteen. "Drink when you need to. We'll stop to rest the horses in a few hours." With that, he thanked Mrs. Fletcher, climbed onto the driver's seat, and set the horses in motion. Virginia watched as Nevada City slowly receded behind them, the small mining town giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine trees. She hadn't had time to process everything that had happened in the last 24 hours: the auction, the rescue, the birth of her son, and now this journey to an unknown future. For a long time they traveled in silence, the rhythmic creaking of the wagon wheels and the steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves the only sounds. Thomas slept peacefully against her chest, seemingly untroubled by the motion of the wagon. After about an hour, Sullivan's deep voice broke the silence. "You should know something about the ranch before we arrive." He didn't turn to look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "It's called Willow Creek Ranch. My father built it 20 years ago, and I took over when he died 5 years back. We run cattle mainly, but also have some horses and grow enough crops to sustain the household and ranch hands." Virginia listened, wondering why he was telling her this. "Emily and I live in the main house. There are 6 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse, and the foreman, Joe Callahan, has his own cabin with his wife Maria. They're good people." He paused. "The cabin I mentioned for you is small but solid. It was built for visiting family, but no one uses it much these days." "It sounds lovely," Virginia said softly, meaning it. After months of uncertainty following her husband's death, the prospect of a safe place for her and Thomas was almost overwhelming. Sullivan glanced back at her briefly. "It's isolated. The nearest town is Grass Valley, about 10 miles from the ranch. Some find the solitude difficult." "After what happened in town, solitude sounds appealing," Virginia replied, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. Sullivan was quiet for a moment. "How did you end up at that auction?" he finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. Virginia sighed, looking down at her sleeping son. She hadn't planned to share her story with this stranger, but something about his quiet strength made her want to explain. "My husband, Frank Edwards, was a gambler. I didn't know that when I married him 3 years ago. He convinced me he was a businessman with prospects." She laughed humorlessly. "I was 19 and naive, eager to escape my uncle's strict household in Sacramento." Sullivan remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. "At first, things were good. Frank had enough money saved to buy a small house in Nevada City, and he seemed to be making a living through various ventures." Virginia shifted Thomas to her other arm. "But about a year ago, his true nature emerged. He started drinking heavily, staying out all night at Walker's saloon. Our savings disappeared, and then he began borrowing money." The wagon hit a rut in the road, and Virginia winced as the jolt sent a wave of pain through her still tender body. Sullivan immediately pulled the horses to a halt. "Are you all right?" Virginia nodded. "Just sore. Please continue on. I want to reach your ranch before dark." Sullivan studied her for a moment as if assessing her truthfulness, then clicked to the horses to resume their journey. Frank died 2 months ago, Virginia continued after they were moving again. A fight at Walker's saloon. He was stabbed. She spoke the words flatly, surprised at how little emotion they now evoked. I was already with child and suddenly alone with no money and a house I couldn't maintain. Then the sheriff came 3 days ago, saying I was responsible for Frank's debts over $150. They seized the house and... Her voice faltered. Well, you saw the rest. Sullivan's knuckles whitened on the reins. It's not legal to auction a person to pay a debt in California. Virginia gave a bitter smile he couldn't see. Sheriff Yates and Jeb Walker are old friends. The law is what they say it is in Nevada City. They fell silent again, the implications of her story hanging in the air between them. After a while, Thomas began to fuss, and Virginia turned slightly away to nurse him, grateful for the privacy afforded by Sullivan's rigid focus on the road ahead. Around midday, Sullivan guided the wagon off the main trail to a small clearing beside a bubbling creek. "We'll rest here," he announced, setting the brake and jumping down from the driver's seat. "The horses need water, and you should stretch your legs if you're able." With Sullivan's help, Virginia climbed carefully from the wagon, Thomas still cradled in one arm. Her legs felt wobbly after hours of sitting, and the soreness from childbirth made each step painful, but the fresh air and the chance to move were welcome. Sullivan led the horses to the creek, then returned with a small bundle from the wagon. "I packed some food. Nothing fancy, but it will keep us going." They sat in the shade of a large oak tree, maintaining a respectful distance as they shared a simple meal of bread, dried beef, and apples. Sullivan ate quickly, his movements efficient, but he waited patiently as Virginia ate one-handed, her other arm supporting Thomas. "May I ask how old you are, Mrs. Edwards?" Sullivan inquired, breaking another long silence. 22, Virginia answered, "though I feel much older some days." A ghost of a smile crossed Sullivan's face. "I understand that feeling. I'm 29, but running the ranch aged me considerably after my father died." This small personal revelation surprised Virginia. Sullivan Kent hadn't struck her as a man who shared much about himself. "And your sister?" "Emily?" she asked, seizing the opening. 24. Married young to a man who died in a mining accident 2 years ago. She came back to the ranch with her 2 little ones. His expression softened slightly when he spoke of his sister. "Her third is due in about 2 months. Virginia nodded, understanding better why he had offered her a position. A pregnant woman with 2 small children would indeed need help. "We should continue," Sullivan said, standing and brushing crumbs from his trousers. "Still have a good distance to cover." The afternoon journey passed more comfortably than the morning. The terrain changed gradually, the hills becoming gentler, with meadows of tall grass interspersed with stands of oak and pine. Virginia found herself growing drowsy in the warm sun, lulled by the rocking motion of the wagon and the exertion of the past day. She must have dozed off, for the next thing she knew, Sullivan was saying her name softly. "Mrs. Edwards, Virginia. We're approaching the ranch." Virginia blinked awake, disoriented for a moment. The sun was lower in the sky now, casting long shadows across a wide valley that opened before them. And there, nestled against a backdrop of hills with a creek winding through the property, stood Willow Creek Ranch. Even from a distance, Virginia could see that it was impressive, far larger than she had imagined. The main house was a 2-story structure built of solid timber, with a wide porch wrapping around the front. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, including what must be the bunkhouse Sullivan had mentioned. Pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle, and she could make out fenced corrals near a large barn. Smoke rose from the chimney of the main house, a welcoming sight as the evening air began to cool. As they drew closer, Virginia saw a figure emerge onto the porch of the main house, a woman with honey blonde hair, her advanced pregnancy evident even at this distance. She shaded her eyes against the setting sun, then waved enthusiastically when she recognized the wagon. "That's Emily," Sullivan explained unnecessarily, a warmth entering his voice that Virginia hadn't heard before. He returned his sister's wave. Two small children burst from the house behind the woman, racing down the steps to the edge of the yard, bouncing with excitement. Sullivan guided the wagon into the yard, bringing it to a halt near the house. Emily was already hurrying down the steps as quickly as her condition allowed, her face alight with curiosity. "Sullivan James Kent, you leave for Nevada City to buy supplies and return with a woman and a baby," she called, her tone mock scolding but her eyes twinkling with good humor. "This is certainly a new approach to solving our household help shortage." Sullivan climbed down from the wagon. "Emily, this is Virginia Edwards and her son Thomas. Mrs. Edwards, my sister, Emily Carter." Emily's expression softened immediately as she approached the wagon and saw Virginia's exhausted face and the tiny bundle in her arms. "Oh, you poor dear. You look completely worn out." She shot a questioning look at her brother. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "I'll explain everything later. Right now, Mrs. Edwards needs rest and a proper meal." Emily nodded, instantly taking charge. "Of course. Children, run and tell Maria we need hot water in the guest room and to set another place for dinner." She turned back to Virginia with a warm smile. "Let's get you and this little one inside. You can tell me everything when you've rested." With Sullivan's help, Virginia climbed down from the wagon, her legs nearly buckling after the long journey. Emily immediately linked an arm through hers, supporting her as they walked toward the house. "How old is your baby?" Emily asked, glancing down at Thomas. "He was born yesterday," Virginia admitted, seeing no reason to hide the truth. Emily stopped short, staring first at Virginia and then at her brother with wide eyes. "Yesterday, Sullivan Kent, what on earth have you done?" "Saved them both from something worse than death," he replied grimly. "I'll explain once Mrs. Edwards is settled." Emily's expression shifted from shock to determination. "Yes, you certainly will." She turned her attention back to Virginia. "Come inside, dear. You need to lie down immediately. Traveling the day after giving birth, it's a wonder you're still on your feet." The interior of the ranch house was even more impressive than its exterior. Polished wooden floors, well-crafted furniture, and colorful woven rugs created a sense of comfort and permanence that made Virginia's heart ache with longing. This was a real home, not just a shelter. Emily led her up a staircase to a spacious bedroom with a large four-poster bed. "This will be your room until you're strong enough to move to the cabin," she declared, helping Virginia sit on the edge of the bed. "The cabin needs a good cleaning anyway before it's suitable for a baby." A middle-aged woman with dark hair streaked with silver entered the room, carrying a steaming pitcher of water. "Maria, this is Virginia Edwards," Emily introduced them. "She and her new baby will be staying with us. Virginia, this is Maria Callahan, our housekeeper and the wife of our foreman." Maria's kind brown eyes took in Virginia's exhausted state and the newborn in her arms. Without comment, she set down the water pitcher and approached. "May I?" she asked softly, extending her arms. Virginia hesitated only briefly before allowing the woman to take Thomas. After all, she was in no position to refuse help, and her arms ached from holding him during the long journey. "Such a beautiful boy," Maria murmured, expertly cradling the infant. I will hold him while you wash and change. Emily, help her. I'll have Josephina bring up some broth and bread." Emily nodded her thanks as Maria carried Thomas to a rocking chair by the window. "Let's get you comfortable," she said to Virginia, turning down the bed covers. "I have a nightgown that should fit you, and we'll find proper clothes tomorrow." Virginia allowed herself to be tended to like a child, too exhausted to protest. Emily helped her wash away the dust of travel with the warm water, then change into a soft cotton nightgown. By the time she was settled in the bed, propped up with pillows, a young girl had arrived with a tray of food. "This is Josephina, Maria's daughter," Emily explained. "She helps with the cooking and cleaning." The girl, who looked to be about 14, bobbed a shy curtsy before setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "Welcome to Willow Creek, madam," she said softly before slipping from the room. Maria brought Thomas back to Virginia once she was settled. "He's a good baby," the housekeeper observed. "Strong lungs but not fussy. You should eat, then feed him, then both of you rest. Tomorrow is soon enough for questions and explanations." With that practical advice, Maria left the room, promising to return later to check on them. Emily settled into the chair Maria had vacated. "She's right, of course. You should eat and rest, but I admit I'm burning with curiosity about how my brother came to bring you here." Virginia sipped the rich chicken broth, feeling its warmth spread through her tired body. "He saved us," she said simply, not ready to recount the full story again. "I don't know what would have happened if he hadn't come along when he did." Emily studied her thoughtfully. "Sullivan has always had a strong sense of justice, sometimes too strong for his own good." She smiled fondly. "Whatever brought you here, I'm glad you've come. It gets lonely being the only woman in the main house, and with this one on the way," she patted her rounded belly, "I can certainly use the help." Virginia nodded, relieved that Emily seemed to accept her presence without demanding immediate explanations. "I'm grateful for the position. I'll work hard, I promise." "We'll talk about all that tomorrow," Emily insisted, rising from the chair as Virginia finished her soup. "Now feed this little one and get some sleep. No one will disturb you until morning." Left alone with Thomas, Virginia finally allowed the tears she had been holding back all day to fall. Tears of exhaustion, relief, grief for what might have been, and cautious hope for what might still be. As Thomas nursed contentedly, untroubled by the dramatic circumstances of his first days of life, Virginia gazed out the window at the sunset painting the hills gold and crimson. Whatever awaited them at Willow Creek Ranch, it had to be better than what they had left behind. And for that, she owed Sullivan Kent a debt she wasn't sure she could ever repay. For the first time in months, Virginia slept deeply and dreamlessly, awakening only when Thomas needed to be fed during the night. The comfortable bed and the knowledge that they were safe combined to give her the rest she desperately needed. Morning sunlight was streaming through the curtains when a soft knock at the door roused her. Emily entered, carrying a tray with breakfast and fresh clothing draped over her arm. "Good morning," she greeted Virginia cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" Virginia sat up carefully, surprised to find that much of the soreness had eased. "Better than yesterday," she admitted, checking on Thomas, who slept peacefully beside her. "Wonderful." Emily set the tray on the bedside table. "I've brought you some clothes. They're mine from before this one started growing." She patted her belly with a smile. "They might be a bit loose on you, but they'll do until we can sort out something more suitable." Virginia thanked her, genuinely touched by the kindness. The clothes were of good quality, a simple navy blue skirt and a cream-colored blouse, along with necessary undergarments. "Sullivan told me what happened," Emily said after Virginia had eaten some of the breakfast. "About the auction." Her usually cheerful face was serious. I'm so sorry you were treated that way. Virginia looked down at her hands. Your brother did more than anyone could have expected. I don't know how to thank him. Emily settled into the chair beside the bed. Sullivan doesn't expect thanks. He did what he thought was right. She paused. He's always been that way, even as a boy. Our father used to say Sullivan had an overdeveloped sense of justice and the stubbornness to back it up. Virginia smiled slightly at that description, which seemed to fit the stern rancher perfectly. He's gone to check the north pasture with Joe this morning, Emily continued, but he wants to speak with you when he returns. In the meantime, I thought you might like to see the cabin where you and Thomas will stay once you're stronger. The idea of leaving the comfortable bedroom wasn't entirely appealing, but Virginia knew she needed to understand what her new situation would entail. I'd like that, she agreed. With Emily's help, Virginia dressed in the borrowed clothes and wrapped Thomas in a soft blanket that Emily had brought for him. The skirt and blouse were indeed loose, but after pinning and tucking, they were presentable enough. Downstairs, Maria greeted them with approval. Much better, she declared, looking Virginia over. A few good meals and you'll be yourself again. Emily's 2 children watched shyly from the doorway to the kitchen, a boy of about 5 and a girl who looked to be 3. These are my little ones, Emily introduced them. William and Grace, this is Mrs. Edwards and her baby Thomas. William stepped forward with the solemnity of a child practicing his manners. Pleased to meet you, madam, he said, extending a small hand. Virginia shook it gravely. Pleased to meet you too, William. Grace, less concerned with formalities, peered curiously at the bundle in Virginia's arms. Baby, she said, pointing. That's right, Virginia agreed, kneeling carefully to show Thomas to the little girl. His name is Thomas. Grace reached out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. Soft, she declared with satisfaction. Emily smiled at the interaction. They've been excited since Uncle Sullivan told them there was a new baby. Now, let's show you the cabin before this one starts fussing. She nodded toward Thomas. The cabin stood about 100 yards from the main house, partially sheltered by a stand of willows growing along the creek that gave the ranch its name. It was small but sturdy, built of the same solid timber as the main house, with a covered porch across the front. Emily produced a key and unlocked the door. Inside was a single large room with a fireplace at one end. A curtained alcove presumably hid a bed, and simple but well-made furniture filled the space. A table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair near the fireplace, a chest of drawers, and shelves built into the walls. It needs a good cleaning and airing out, Emily said, opening the shutters to let in fresh air and light, but it's sound. No leaks in the roof and the fireplace draws well. Virginia walked slowly around the space, taking it all in. After the loss of her home in Nevada City, the prospect of having this cabin to herself and Thomas was almost overwhelming. It's perfect, she said softly, meaning it. Far better than I expected. Emily beamed. I'm so glad you like it. I was thinking we could move a cradle in for Thomas. One of the ranch hands, Ben Cooper, is quite skilled with woodworking. I'm sure he could make something suitable. They were discussing what supplies the cabin would need when the door opened, and Sullivan Kent filled the doorway. He was dressed in working clothes, a faded blue shirt open at the collar, sturdy denim trousers, and dusty boots. His black hat was pushed back on his head, revealing tousled dark hair damp with sweat. Emily said I'd find you here, he said, his deep voice echoing slightly in the small space. How are you feeling, Mrs. Edwards? Much better, thank you, Virginia replied, suddenly aware of how she must look in Emily's ill-fitting clothes, her hair hastily braided. If Sullivan noticed, he gave no indication. He stepped inside, removing his hat. I wanted to discuss the arrangements for your position here. Emily glanced between them. Perhaps I should take Thomas back to the house. Grace would love to watch him while you two talk. Before Virginia could protest, Emily had gently taken the sleeping baby from her arms. "Don't worry, I've had plenty of practice," she assured Virginia with a smile. "Take your time." With that, she left the cabin, closing the door behind her. Sullivan gestured to one of the chairs at the table. "Please sit down. You're still recovering." Virginia complied, grateful for his consideration. Sullivan remained standing, his tall frame seeming too large for the small cabin. "As I mentioned, the position is to help Emily with the household and her children," he began without preamble. "She's been managing alone since returning to the ranch after her husband died, but with her third child on the way, it's becoming too much for her." Virginia nodded. "I understand. I'm happy to help in any way I can. Your duties would include helping with the cooking, cleaning, laundry, and looking after William and Grace when Emily needs rest." Sullivan's tone was matter-of-fact, as if discussing a business arrangement which, Virginia reminded herself, this was. "In return, you and your son will have this cabin, meals, and a wage of $15 per month." Virginia couldn't hide her surprise. $15 was a generous sum for such a position, especially with room and board included. "That's very fair," she said. Sullivan seemed satisfied with her response. "Good. Maria will show you what needs to be done in the house. You can start whenever you feel strong enough." "I can start tomorrow," Virginia offered, not wanting to appear lazy or ungrateful. Sullivan frowned slightly. "There's no rush. Emily insisted you take at least a week to recover." His expression softened almost imperceptibly. She was quite adamant about it, actually. Virginia found herself smiling at the thought of the pregnant Emily giving orders to her imposing brother. "She's very kind." "She is," Sullivan agreed. He hesitated, then added, "There's something else we need to discuss." He finally sat down at the table across from her. "The men who know you came here from Nevada City, they believe you're a widow I hired to help Emily." Virginia understood immediately. "You didn't tell them about the auction." Sullivan shook his head. "Only Emily and Maria know the full story. I thought it best for you and Thomas to have a fresh start, without that hanging over you." Gratitude washed over Virginia. He had not only rescued her from a terrible fate, but was now protecting her reputation as well. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very thoughtful." "It's nothing." Sullivan dismissed her thanks, looking uncomfortable. "Just practical. Small communities thrive on gossip, and the ranch hands are no different. Better to give them a simple story they can accept." Virginia studied him, wondering again what had brought this man to that auction yard at precisely the right moment. There was more to Sullivan Kent than the stern, practical rancher he presented to the world, a depth of compassion he seemed determined to hide. "Is there anything else you need to know?" Sullivan asked, rising from the chair as if eager to end the conversation. Virginia thought for a moment. "Just one thing. What exactly should I tell people about how I came to be here, if anyone asks directly?" Sullivan considered the question. "Say you knew Emily years ago in Sacramento. After your husband died, you wrote to her seeking work and she suggested you come here." He met her eyes. Simple, believable, and close enough to the truth in some ways. Virginia nodded. It was a good story, one she could remember and repeat if necessary. "I should get back to work," Sullivan said, settling his hat back on his head. "Joe and I are moving cattle to the east pasture today." "Of course." Virginia stood as well, wincing slightly at the lingering soreness in her body. Sullivan noticed the wince. "Remember what Emily said about taking time to recover. The work will wait." With that, he nodded politely and left the cabin. Virginia remained standing in the middle of the small space, trying to make sense of the enigma that was Sullivan Kent. A man who would pay $200 to rescue a stranger from an auction block, yet seemed uncomfortable accepting gratitude for the deed. A man who noticed her discomfort but maintained a careful distance. Whatever his reasons, she was thankful to be at Willow Creek Ranch, with its promise of safety and a new beginning for her and Thomas. The rest, she decided, would sort itself out in time. True to her word, Emily insisted that Virginia rest for the remainder of the week, spending her days in the comfortable guest room of the main house. Maria and Josephina took turns caring for Thomas when Virginia needed to sleep, and Emily herself was a constant, cheerful presence, filling Virginia in on the workings of the ranch and the surrounding community. Sullivan, meanwhile, was rarely seen. He left the house before dawn each morning and often returned after Virginia had retired for the night. On the few occasions when they did encounter each other, he was unfailingly polite but distant, asking about her health and Thomas's well-being in the same tone he might inquire about the weather. By the end of the week, Virginia was feeling much stronger and increasingly restless. While she appreciated Emily's kindness, she was eager to begin earning her keep and establishing her own routine in the cabin, which the ranch hands had been preparing under Emily's supervision. "Are you certain you're ready?" Emily asked when Virginia expressed her desire to move to the cabin and begin her duties. They were sitting on the front porch of the main house, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Thomas slept in a cradle that Ben Cooper, the ranch hand with woodworking skills, had indeed crafted a beautiful piece of workmanship made from golden pine with intricate carvings of leaves and vines along the sides. "I'm sure," Virginia assured her. "I've never been one for idleness and I'm feeling much better now." Emily studied her thoughtfully. "Sullivan will say it's too soon." Virginia smiled slightly. "With all due respect to your brother, I believe I know my own strength." Emily laughed at that. "Fair enough. We can move your things to the cabin tomorrow. Ben and Miguel have finished cleaning it and Maria has stocked the pantry with basics." She patted Virginia's hand. "I'm glad you're here, you know, not just for the help, though heaven knows I need it, but for the company. It's been lonely being the only woman in the house besides Maria, and she's so busy with her duties." Virginia was touched by the sincerity in Emily's voice. In just a week, she had come to genuinely like the younger woman, with her open nature and ready laugh. "I'm glad to be here too," she said honestly. The sound of hoofbeats drew their attention to the yard, where Sullivan was dismounting from his horse. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped slightly as he handed the reins to a waiting ranch hand. When he turned toward the house and saw the two women on the porch, he straightened, his expression settling into its usual inscrutable mask. "Ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat as he climbed the porch steps. "You're back early," Emily observed, raising an eyebrow. "I thought you and Joe were checking fence lines all day." "Finished sooner than expected," Sullivan replied. His gaze moved to Virginia. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Edwards?" "Well enough to move to the cabin tomorrow," Virginia answered directly, "and to begin helping Emily with her duties." Sullivan frowned. "There's no rush. Another few days of rest would make me quite restless," Virginia interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Kent, but I'm accustomed to hard work." Sullivan looked as if he wanted to argue but glanced at his sister's amused expression and apparently thought better of it. "As you wish," he conceded. "I'll have Ben and Miguel help move your things in the morning." With that, he excused himself and entered the house, leaving Virginia feeling oddly triumphant at having stood her ground. Emily chuckled softly. "Well done. Sullivan isn't used to being contradicted, especially by women." Virginia flushed slightly. "I didn't mean to be disrespectful." It's just that you want to establish yourself here on your own terms, Emily finished for her. I understand completely. After Michael died, I wanted the same thing. A shadow crossed her face at the mention of her late husband. Sullivan means well, but he can be overbearing in his protectiveness. Virginia couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Sullivan's concern than simple protectiveness, but she kept the thought to herself as they watched the sun begin its descent behind the western hills. True to his word, Sullivan sent Ben and Miguel to help move Virginia's few possessions to the cabin the next morning. By midday, she was settled in her new home, arranging the clothing Emily had given her in the chest of drawers and placing Thomas's cradle near the bed in the curtained alcove. The cabin felt wonderfully private after a week in the busy main house. Virginia moved around the space, familiarizing herself with every corner, from the small pantry stocked with flour, sugar, coffee, and other staples to the wooden tub behind a screen that would serve for bathing. A soft knock at the open door interrupted her explorations. Sullivan stood on the threshold, looking uncertain, an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. "May I come in?" he asked formally. Virginia nodded, suddenly aware of the intimacy of having this man in what was now her private space. "Of course." Sullivan stepped inside, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I brought you this," he said, extending the bundle to her. "It might be useful." Virginia accepted the package and carefully unwrapped it to reveal a small revolver with a mother-of-pearl handle. She looked up at him in surprise. "It was my mother's," Sullivan explained. "Emily doesn't care for firearms, but I thought you might want it, being out here alone with the baby." Virginia turned the weapon over in her hands. It was small enough to fit comfortably in her grip, clearly designed for a woman's hand. "I don't know how to use it," she admitted. "I can teach you," Sullivan offered. "It's not complicated, but you need to respect its power." Virginia nodded, touched by his concern for her safety. "Thank you. I would appreciate that." Sullivan cleared his throat, seeming uncomfortable with her gratitude. "There's something else. I had Joe ride into Grass Valley yesterday to inquire about your husband's debts." At her startled look, he continued quickly. "I wanted to make sure there wouldn't be any legal repercussions following you here." Virginia's heart raced. "And?" The debts were legitimate, but the auction was not. Sheriff Yates overstepped his authority, likely at Walker's urging. Sullivan's jaw tightened. "I've sent a letter to the territorial marshal explaining the situation. It might not lead to any consequences for them, but at least there's an official record of the wrongdoing." Virginia sank onto the edge of a chair, overwhelmed by this news. Sullivan Kent had not only rescued her but was now seeking justice on her behalf without even telling her. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," Sullivan replied, his voice firm. "What they did was wrong. It shouldn't go unchallenged." In that moment, Virginia saw clearly the man beneath the stern exterior, a man of principle, of unwavering conviction. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing that more effusive gratitude would only make him uncomfortable. Sullivan nodded once, accepting her thanks. "I'll come by tomorrow afternoon to show you how to use the revolver. For now, I should get back to work." He turned to leave, then paused. "The cabin suits you," he said, glancing around the space she had already begun to make her own. "It's good to see it lived in again." With that cryptic comment, he left, leaving Virginia to wonder about the history of the small cabin and why it had stood empty until now. The following weeks settled into a rhythm as Virginia found her place at Willow Creek Ranch. Each morning, she would feed Thomas at dawn, then walk to the main house to help Maria prepare breakfast for Sullivan and the ranch hands before they headed out for the day's work. After breakfast, she would assist Emily with household chores, laundering, mending, baking bread, or preserving the late summer produce from the kitchen garden. Thomas thrived in the peaceful environment, growing stronger each day. Emily's children adored him, especially little Grace, who liked to sit beside his cradle, solemnly explaining the workings of the ranch to the attentive infant. True to his word, Sullivan taught Virginia how to handle the revolver, taking her to a clearing behind the cabin and patiently demonstrating how to load, aim, and fire the weapon. His hands were surprisingly gentle as he corrected her grip, his deep voice calm as he explained the mechanics. Virginia found herself increasingly aware of him during these lessons, the scent of leather and clean sweat that clung to him, the careful way he moved, the rare smile that transformed his serious face when she hit her target. As September gave way to October, the days grew shorter and cooler. Virginia's 23rd birthday came and went, marked only by a small cake that Emily insisted on baking when Virginia casually mentioned the date. Sullivan presented her with a warm woolen shawl for the occasion, explaining gruffly that the cabin could get cold at night once winter set in. It was a simple life, but after the tumult of her marriage to Frank, Virginia found deep contentment in the predictable routines and honest work. The ranch hands treated her with respect, tipping their hats when they passed her in the yard and offering to carry heavy loads or chop extra firewood for her cabin. Even Joe Callahan, the taciturn foreman who initially seemed suspicious of her presence, gradually warmed to her, especially after she mended his favorite shirt that had been badly torn during a cattle drive. Only Sullivan remained something of an enigma. Some days he would stop by her cabin in the evening, ostensibly to check if she needed anything, but lingering to talk about the day's events or to sit quietly while she nursed Thomas. Other times, he would avoid her for days, communicating only through Emily or Maria. Virginia couldn't make sense of his behavior, but she was too grateful for her position at the ranch to question it. One crisp October evening, as Virginia sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink, she heard approaching footsteps. Sullivan emerged from the path that led from the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the colorful sky. "Evening, Mrs. Edwards," he greeted her, removing his hat. "May I join you?" Virginia gestured to the second chair on the small porch. "Of course. Thomas is already asleep, so I'm enjoying a moment of quiet." Sullivan settled into the chair, stretching his long legs out before him. "It's a beautiful evening," he observed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. They sat in companionable silence for a time, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Virginia had come to appreciate these quiet moments with Sullivan, when the walls he maintained seemed to lower slightly. "I received a reply from the territorial marshal today," Sullivan said eventually, his voice cutting through the silence, "about the auction in Nevada City." Virginia tensed, her peaceful mood instantly shattered. "What did he say?" Sullivan turned to look at her, his expression difficult to read in the fading light. "Sheriff Yates has been removed from his position. Apparently there had been other complaints, and this was the final straw." Virginia's breath caught. "And Walker, the saloon owner, fined for his part in the scheme. Not enough punishment, in my opinion, but something at least." Sullivan's voice held a hint of satisfaction. "More importantly, the marshal assured me that the auction has been officially declared null and void. You were never legally sold to anyone." Virginia closed her eyes briefly, relief washing over her. Though she had tried not to dwell on what had happened in Nevada City, the legal uncertainty had weighed on her more than she had admitted, even to herself. "Thank you," she said softly, "for pursuing this. I never would have had the means or knowledge to do so myself." Sullivan shrugged, dismissing her gratitude as he always did. "It was the right thing to do." Virginia studied his profile in the dimming light, gathering her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Mr. Kent, Sullivan, may I ask you something personal?" He turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. It was the first time she had used his given name. "You may ask," he said cautiously. "Why were you at the auction that day?" Virginia asked simply. "In Nevada City." "You've never said what brought you there at that exact moment." Sullivan was quiet for so long that Virginia thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, tinged with an emotion she couldn't immediately identify. "I was there to buy supplies for the ranch. We needed tools, ammunition, some specialized equipment for the new well we're digging." He paused. "I was walking past the auction yard when I heard the auctioneer's spiel. At first, I thought I had misunderstood. Surely he couldn't be auctioning a person in 1876 in California." Sullivan's hands tightened on the arms of his chair. "When I realized what was happening, I couldn't walk away. It reminded me too much of something from my past." He fell silent again, and Virginia waited, sensing there was more he wanted to say. "My mother was a slave," he finally continued, the words coming out in a rush. "In Tennessee before the war. My father was her owner's son. When he fell in love with her, his family disowned him. They came west, as far from Tennessee as they could get, and built this ranch." Virginia absorbed this revelation in silence. It explained so much: his fierce reaction to the auction, his determination to right the wrong, perhaps even his sometimes distant demeanor. "After they died, my father 5 years ago, my mother 3 years before that, I found my mother's journals. She wrote about the auction block, about the terror and humiliation of being inspected and bid on like livestock." His voice had grown hoarse. "When I saw you there, in labor and still being sold to the highest bidder, something in me just broke." Virginia reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his. His skin was warm and rough from years of ranch work. "I understand now," she said quietly, "and I'm even more grateful, knowing what it must have cost you to intervene so publicly." Sullivan looked down at her hand covering his, then slowly turned his palm upward to clasp her fingers. It was the first time he had intentionally touched her outside of helping her with the revolver or assisting her in and out of wagons. "I've never told anyone outside the family about my mother," he admitted. "The ranch hands know. Of course it was no secret that Catherine Kent had been a slave, but I don't speak of it." "Thank you for trusting me with the truth," Virginia said, oddly touched that he had chosen to confide in her. They sat in silence again, their hands still joined, until Sullivan gently disengaged his fingers and stood. "It's getting dark. You should go inside where it's warm." Virginia nodded, rising as well. "Good night, Sullivan." He settled his hat back on his head, his face once again in shadow. "Good night, Virginia." He hesitated, then added, "Thank you for listening." As she watched him walk back toward the main house, Virginia realized something had shifted between them. The careful distance Sullivan had maintained since bringing her to the ranch had narrowed, and in its place was a tentative connection based on shared confidences and growing trust. Inside the cabin, she checked on Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his cradle, then prepared for bed, her mind still processing Sullivan's revelation. As she blew out the lamp and settled under the covers, Virginia acknowledged to herself what she had been trying to deny for weeks. She was developing feelings for Sullivan Kent that went far beyond gratitude for her rescue or appreciation for his kindness. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. Her heart had led her astray once before with Frank, and the consequences had nearly been devastating. Could she trust her judgment now? And even if she could, what reason did she have to believe Sullivan might return her feelings? With these unanswered questions circling in her mind, Virginia drifted into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of auctions and rescues, of strong arms carrying her to safety and blue eyes that held secrets and sorrows too deep to fathom. November brought the first true cold of the season, with frost etching delicate patterns on the cabin windows each morning, and smoke rising in straight columns from chimneys across the ranch. Virginia had settled completely into her role, becoming indispensable to Emily as the latter's pregnancy advanced into its final weeks. The relationship between Virginia and Sullivan continued to evolve in subtle ways following their conversation on her porch. He began taking his evening meals at the main house more regularly, often lingering afterward to sit by the fire and listen as Virginia read aloud to Emily and the children. Sometimes he would stop by Virginia's cabin during the day, bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, fresh apples from the orchard, a tiny wooden horse he had whittled for Thomas. For her part, Virginia found herself looking forward to these interactions with an eagerness that both excited and alarmed her. She tried to keep her growing feelings hidden, maintaining a friendly but respectful demeanor around Sullivan, especially when others were present. But in private moments, when their eyes met across a room or their hands accidentally touched while passing a plate at dinner, Virginia could feel the current of awareness that flowed between them. Emily, despite being occupied with her advancing pregnancy and her two active children, was too perceptive not to notice the change. One afternoon in mid-November, as Virginia helped her sort through baby clothes in preparation for the new arrival, Emily broached the subject. "Sullivan seems happier these days," she remarked casually, folding a tiny nightgown. Virginia concentrated on the blanket she was mending. "Does he? I hadn't noticed." Emily laughed softly. "Virginia Edwards, you are a terrible liar. Of course you've noticed. Just as you've noticed how he finds excuses to be wherever you are." Virginia felt her cheeks grow warm. "He's being kind, that's all, making sure Thomas and I have everything we need." Emily hummed skeptically. "Is that why he spends an hour whittling toys for a baby who can't even grasp them yet? Or why he asked Maria to teach him how to make those cinnamon cookies you mentioned liking?" Virginia's head snapped up in surprise. "He did that." Emily's triumphant smile told Virginia she had walked right into her friend's trap. "He did. Sullivan hasn't shown this much interest in pleasing anyone since." She trailed off, a shadow crossing her face. "Since when?" Virginia prompted, curious despite her embarrassment. Emily sighed, setting aside the clothes she had been folding. "Since Rebecca. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher. They were engaged to be married 3 years ago." Virginia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Sullivan had been engaged. He had never mentioned a fiancé. What happened? "She died," Emily said simply. "Influenza. It swept through the area that winter, took a dozen people before it was done. Rebecca was one of the first." She looked at Virginia with sympathy. "Sullivan was devastated. He threw himself into running the ranch after that, barely speaking to anyone for months. I was worried he'd never open his heart again." Virginia absorbed this new information about Sullivan, understanding better now his sometimes distant demeanor and the sorrow she occasionally glimpsed in his eyes. "I'm so sorry. That must have been terrible for him." "It was," Emily agreed. "But time heals even if it leaves scars. And now—" She smiled softly at Virginia. "Now I see him coming back to life when he's around you." Virginia shook her head, not daring to hope. "Emily, I'm a widow with a baby working for him. Even if what you're suggesting were true—" "It is true," Emily interrupted firmly. "I know my brother. And I see the way you look at him when you think no one is watching." Virginia felt her face flush even deeper. "Even so, it's complicated. My husband died less than a year ago." Emily reached across the pile of baby clothes to squeeze Virginia's hand. From what you've told me about Frank Edwards, there wasn't much love lost there by the end. And life is too short and too precious to deny your heart what it wants, especially out here where each day is a gift. Before Virginia could formulate a response to this frank assessment, a commotion outside drew their attention. Emily rose awkwardly to look out the window. "The men are back early," she observed, "and something's wrong." Virginia joined her at the window. A group of riders was entering the yard, Sullivan at their head, but there was another figure slumped in the saddle in front of him, held in place by Sullivan's arm. "It's Miguel," Emily gasped. "He looks hurt." They hurried downstairs as quickly as Emily's condition allowed, reaching the front door just as Sullivan and Joe were helping the injured ranch hand into the house. "What happened?" Emily demanded, moving aside to let them pass. "Steer gored him," Joe explained tersely. "We were moving the herd to the winter pasture when a bull broke loose. Miguel tried to head it off. Sullivan and Joe half carried Miguel to a sofa in the sitting room. The young man's face was ashen, and blood soaked his left side where his shirt had been hastily bandaged with a neckerchief. "Maria," Emily called. "Bring hot water and the medicine chest." Virginia was already kneeling beside Miguel, gently removing the makeshift bandage to assess the wound. "The bleeding has slowed, but it's deep," she reported, her voice calm despite the grisly sight. "He'll need stitches." Sullivan looked at her in surprise. "You know how to stitch a wound," Virginia nodded. "My father was a doctor in Sacramento before he died. I often assisted him." It was a skill she had never expected to use again, especially after marrying Frank, who had dismissed her medical knowledge as unsuitable for a proper wife. Maria arrived with the requested supplies, and Emily instructed the men to clear the room. "Virginia will tend to him. The rest of you wait outside." Sullivan hesitated, looking at Virginia uncertainly. "Are you sure you can do this?" Virginia met his gaze steadily. "I'm sure. I've done it many times before." Something like respect flickered in Sullivan's eyes before he nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him. For the next hour, Virginia worked methodically, cleaning the wound, stitching the torn flesh with neat, even stitches, and finally bandaging Miguel's side. The young man had passed out from the pain early in the process, which made her task easier. When she finally emerged from the sitting room, wiping her bloodied hands on a towel, Sullivan was pacing the hallway. "How is he?" he asked immediately. "He'll live," Virginia assured him. "The horn missed any vital organs. He's young and strong with rest and care. He should recover fully." Sullivan's relief was evident in the way his shoulders relaxed. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "If we'd had to take him all the way to the doctor in Grass Valley." "He might not have made it," Virginia finished for him. "I'm glad I could help." Sullivan studied her face. "You're remarkable," he said softly. "Just when I think I understand you, you reveal another layer." Virginia felt warmth bloom in her chest at his praise. "Hardly remarkable. Just useful knowledge in a difficult situation." "No," Sullivan shook his head. "It's more than that. Your calmness, your competence. Not everyone could have done what you just did." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Virginia felt that current of awareness strengthen between them. Then Maria emerged from the sitting room, breaking the spell. "Miguel is awake and asking for water," she reported. "I'll get it," Virginia said quickly, moving past Sullivan toward the kitchen. Later that evening, after Miguel had been settled in one of the downstairs rooms of the main house for monitoring, Virginia returned to her cabin. Thomas had spent the day with Josefina, who had proven to be an excellent and willing babysitter. Virginia found her son fed and sleeping peacefully in his cradle, a sight that never failed to fill her with profound gratitude. She had just changed into her nightgown and was brushing her hair when a knock sounded at the door. Pulling on her robe, Virginia opened it to find Sullivan standing there, a lantern in his hand casting golden light across his features. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he said. "I just wanted to check on you after today's events. It can be unsettling to deal with such injuries." Virginia smiled, touched by his concern. "I'm fine, truly. Would you like to come in for a moment? Thomas is asleep." Sullivan hesitated briefly before nodding and stepping inside. Virginia closed the door against the night chill and gestured for him to sit at the small table. She remained standing, suddenly aware of her state of undress, though her robe covered her completely. "Miguel asked me to convey his thanks," Sullivan said, setting the lantern on the table. "He's resting comfortably now." "I'm glad," Virginia replied. "He was very brave." Sullivan nodded. "He is one of my best hands." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next. "Virginia, there's something I've been meaning to discuss with you." The use of her given name, still rare enough to feel significant, made her heart beat faster. "Yes, your position here at the ranch." Sullivan's expression was serious. "You've become invaluable to Emily, and with the baby coming any day now, she'll need you more than ever." Virginia felt a flicker of anxiety. Was he going to suggest changes to their arrangement? "I'm happy to help Emily in any way I can." "I know that," Sullivan assured her quickly. "What I'm trying to say is that I'd like to make your position permanent, not just for Emily's sake but for—" he hesitated, "for the ranch, for all of us." Virginia wasn't sure what she had expected, but this formal offer of permanent employment wasn't it. She tried to hide her disappointment. "That's very kind. Of course I'd like to stay." Sullivan seemed to sense her uncertainty. "I've also been thinking about Thomas's future. A boy needs education opportunities." "Yes," Virginia agreed cautiously, wondering where this conversation was heading. "Grass Valley has a good school, but it's too far for daily travel from the ranch. In a few years, when he's old enough." Sullivan paused again, clearly uncomfortable. "What I'm trying to say is that I want you both to feel secure here, to know that this is your home for as long as you wish it to be." Virginia's throat tightened with emotion. After months of uncertainty following Frank's death, the offer of a permanent home was more precious than Sullivan could possibly know. "Thank you," she managed. "That means more than I can express." Sullivan nodded, then stood abruptly. "I should let you rest. It's been a long day." He moved toward the door, but Virginia impulsively stepped into his path. "Sullivan, wait. There's something I should tell you as well." He stopped, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart race. "What is it?" Virginia took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done for Thomas and me. Not just the rescue in Nevada City, but everything since this cabin, the work, your kindness." She met his eyes steadily. "You've given us a new life, a chance at happiness I didn't think was possible anymore." Sullivan's expression softened. "You've earned your place here, Virginia. Your hard work, your skills like today with Miguel. The ranch is better for having you here." "Even so," Virginia persisted, needing him to understand, "I don't take it for granted, and I want you to know that I—" She faltered, suddenly afraid to reveal too much of her heart. Sullivan waited, standing so close that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. When she didn't continue, he gently asked, "You what, Virginia?" "I care for you," she finally said, the words barely above a whisper. "More than I should, perhaps, given our circumstances." Sullivan drew in a sharp breath. For a long, terrible moment, he said nothing, and Virginia feared she had completely misread the situation, had destroyed the careful balance they had established. Then, slowly, Sullivan raised his hand to her face, his calloused fingers gentle against her cheek. "Virginia," he murmured, her name sounding like a prayer on his lips, Before he could say more, the cabin door burst open. They jumped apart as Joe Callahan rushed in, not even seeming to notice the intimate tableau he had interrupted. "Sullivan, it's Emily. The baby's coming, and Maria says there's something wrong. She sent me to fetch Virginia and to tell you to ride for the doctor in Grass Valley right away." All thoughts of their interrupted moment vanished as Virginia sprang into action. "Let me get dressed. I'll be at the house in 5 minutes." She turned to Sullivan, whose face had drained of color at Joe's news. "Go, ride for the doctor. I'll do what I can for Emily until he arrives." Sullivan nodded, already moving toward the door. "Joe, wake Ben and have him saddle my fastest horse." He paused at the threshold, looking back at Virginia with an intensity that conveyed everything they had no time to say. "Take care of her." "I will," Virginia promised. "Now go." As Sullivan and Joe rushed out into the night, Virginia hastily dressed, her heart pounding with fear for Emily and the unborn child. The moment of connection with Sullivan would have to wait. Right now, her friend needed her. The scene in the main house was one of controlled chaos. Maria had moved Emily to her bedroom and was busy preparing hot water and clean linens. William and Grace had been awakened by the commotion and were sitting wide-eyed on the staircase, watching as ranch hands hurried in and out with supplies. Virginia knelt beside them. "Your mama is having the baby," she explained gently. "She needs quiet and calm. Can you be brave and go with Josephina to the kitchen for some warm milk?" The children nodded solemnly, and Virginia signaled to Josephina, who had been hovering nearby. "Keep them occupied," she instructed the girl. "And check on Thomas in my cabin, please." With the children taken care of, Virginia hurried upstairs to Emily's room. The pregnant woman was lying on her bed, her face contorted in pain as Maria wiped her brow with a damp cloth. "Virginia," Emily gasped, reaching out a trembling hand. "Something's not right. The pains are different from before." Virginia took her hand, squeezing it reassuringly while looking to Maria for more information. "The pain started an hour ago," the housekeeper explained. "Very strong from the beginning and too close together. And there's been bleeding." Virginia nodded, her medical knowledge immediately alerting her to possible complications. "Let me examine you, Emily," she said calmly, though her own heart was racing with fear for her friend. After a careful examination, Virginia's concerns deepened. The baby was positioned incorrectly, and Emily's labor was progressing too rapidly for comfort. "Sullivan has gone for the doctor," she assured Emily, "but we need to try to slow things down until he arrives." For the next 2 hours, Virginia and Maria worked together to make Emily as comfortable as possible, using every technique Virginia had learned from her father to manage the labor. But despite their efforts, Emily's condition deteriorated. The bleeding increased, and her strength was clearly failing. "Virginia," Emily whispered during a brief respite between contractions, "if something happens to me, promise you'll look after my children." "Nothing's going to happen," Virginia insisted, though fear clawed at her chest. "You're going to be fine. The doctor will be here soon." Emily gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Promise me," she demanded. "William and Grace, they need a mother." Virginia blinked back tears. "I promise," she said solemnly, "but it won't come to that. You're going to meet your new baby and watch all 3 of your children grow up." Emily's face contorted as another contraction seized her, this one even more intense than the last. "It's coming now," she gasped. "I can feel it." Virginia positioned herself to deliver the baby, silently praying that her limited medical knowledge would be enough. With Maria supporting Emily from behind, Virginia guided the laboring woman through the final, excruciating moments of childbirth. When at last the baby emerged, a tiny boy with a shock of dark hair, he was silent and still, his little face tinged blue. "What's wrong?" Emily asked weakly, trying to see her child. "Why isn't he crying?" Virginia quickly cut the cord and took the infant to the wash basin Maria had prepared. With gentle but firm motions, she cleared the baby's mouth and nose, then rubbed his back and chest, willing him to take a breath. "Come on, little one," she murmured. "Your mama is waiting to meet you." Just when Virginia was beginning to despair, the tiny body jerked, and a thin wail filled the room. Relief flooded through her as the baby's color began to improve with each subsequent cry. "He's perfect," Virginia announced, wrapping the now screaming infant in a clean blanket and bringing him to Emily. "You have another son." Emily's exhausted face transformed with joy as she cradled her newborn. "Hello, my darling," she whispered. "You gave us quite a scare." Virginia and Maria exchanged worried glances over Emily's head. The new mother was still bleeding heavily, and her skin had taken on an alarming pallor. The baby might be safe, but Emily's condition remained critical. "Maria, stay with her," Virginia instructed. "I'm going to prepare some herbs that might help slow the bleeding." As Virginia hurried downstairs to the kitchen where the medicinal herbs were kept, she heard the thunder of hooves in the yard. Looking out the window, she saw Sullivan dismounting from a lathered horse, helping an older man down from another mount, the doctor from Grass Valley. Virginia rushed outside to meet them. "The baby's been born," she reported quickly. "A boy, alive and seemingly healthy, but Emily is bleeding badly." The doctor, a gray-haired man with a weathered face and kind eyes, nodded briskly. "Show me to her," he ordered, grabbing his medical bag from his saddle. Sullivan caught Virginia's arm as she turned to lead the doctor inside. "Will she be all right?" he asked, his voice raw with fear for his sister. Virginia wished she could offer reassurance, but she wouldn't lie to him. "I don't know," she admitted. "She's very weak. But the doctor is here now and will do everything possible." Sullivan's grip on her arm tightened momentarily before he released her. "Go," he said. "Help the doctor. I'll check on the children." The next hour was a blur of activity as Virginia assisted the doctor in his efforts to save Emily's life. He worked efficiently, applying techniques and medicines Virginia had only heard about from her father but never seen used. Gradually, the bleeding subsided, and some color returned to Emily's cheeks. "She'll need complete rest for at least 2 weeks," the doctor instructed as he packed his bag. "No exertion whatsoever. The baby can be brought to her for nursing, but someone else must handle all other care." "I'll stay with her," Virginia volunteered immediately. "We'll manage." The doctor nodded approvingly. "You did well before I arrived. Without your quick action with the baby and your efforts to slow the bleeding, we might have lost them both." Virginia accepted the praise with a nod, too exhausted for more. Dawn was breaking outside the windows, casting golden light across Emily's bedroom where the new mother now slept, her tiny son in a cradle beside her bed. Downstairs, Virginia found Sullivan sitting at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his face haggard with worry. "The doctor says she'll recover with rest," Virginia told him, sinking into a chair across from him. "The baby is strong and healthy." Relief washed over Sullivan's features. "Thank God," he murmured. "And thank you, Virginia." "The doctor said you saved them both before he arrived." Virginia shook her head. "I only did what I could with the knowledge I had. It was fortunate he got here when he did." Sullivan reached across the table to take her hand. "You're too modest. Without you." He couldn't finish the sentence, emotion choking his voice. Virginia turned her hand in his, their fingers intertwining. "Emily asked me to look after the children if anything happened to her," she said softly. "I promised I would." Sullivan's eyes, red-rimmed from fear and exhaustion, held hers. She knew she could trust you with what matters most to her. They sat in silence for a moment, both too tired for more words but drawing comfort from the connection of their joined hands. The quiet of the kitchen was broken only by the distant sounds of ranch hands beginning their daily chores and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. "You should rest," Sullivan finally said, reluctantly releasing her hand. "You've been up all night. I'll stay with Emily for a while." Virginia nodded, suddenly aware of her bone-deep weariness. "Wake me if there's any change, and Thomas will be hungry soon." "Josephina brought him to the house during the night," Sullivan told her. "He's sleeping in the nursery with William and Grace. They're all fine." Virginia smiled gratefully, touched by how everyone had pulled together during the crisis. "I'll check on them, then lie down for a bit." As she stood to leave, Sullivan caught her hand once more. "Virginia," he said, his voice low and intense. "About what you said last night before we were interrupted." Virginia felt her cheeks warm at the memory of her confession. "We can talk about that another time. You have enough to worry about now with Emily and the new baby." Sullivan shook his head. "No, this needs to be said." He rose to stand before her, still holding her hand. "I care for you too, more than I thought possible after Rebecca died, more than is probably wise, given how we met and the circumstances that brought you here." Virginia's heart soared at his words, even as she recognized the complications he was acknowledging. "Sullivan, let me finish," he said gently. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us. But I do know that having you here, watching you with Thomas, with Emily's children, seeing your strength and compassion, it's made me want things I had given up on. A family of my own, a partner to share this life with." Virginia's eyes filled with tears of exhaustion and emotion. "I want those things too," she whispered. "But there's so much to consider. Thomas, your responsibilities here, my position." Sullivan raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I know, and we have time to figure it all out. For now, just know that what you feel isn't one-sided." His blue eyes, so often guarded, were open and vulnerable as they met hers. "We'll talk more when we've both had some rest, when Emily is stronger." Virginia nodded, her heart too full for words. As she made her way upstairs to check on the children before finding a bed to collapse into, she felt a lightness despite her exhaustion. For the first time since learning of her husband's death, the future seemed full of promise rather than uncertainty. The weeks following Emily's difficult childbirth transformed life at Willow Creek Ranch in ways both practical and profound. As Emily gradually regained her strength, Virginia essentially took over running the household, caring not only for Thomas but also for William, Grace, and the newest addition to the family, whom Emily had named James after her father. Sullivan's responsibilities kept him busy from dawn until dusk, as winter preparations for the ranch couldn't wait, even with his sister recovering. But each evening, he would return to the main house where Virginia was staying temporarily to be near Emily, and they would share the events of the day over a late supper after the children were in bed. These quiet moments became precious to Virginia, a time when they could speak freely about their growing feelings and the future they were beginning to envision together. Sullivan's initial hesitancy gave way to a certainty that Virginia found both reassuring and thrilling. "I want to court you properly," he told her one evening in early December as they sat before the fire in the main house parlor. Emily had retired early with little James, and the other children were long asleep. "Not as your employer or rescuer, but as a man who admires and respects you." Virginia smiled, warmed by more than just the firelight. "I'd like that, though I'm not sure how proper courting works when we already live on the same property and see each other every day." Sullivan chuckled. a sound that had become more frequent in recent weeks. "We could ride into Grass Valley for the Christmas social at the church. Let me show you off to the neighbors as something other than Emily's companion." "Show me off." Virginia raised an eyebrow, though she was secretly pleased by the idea. "Perhaps that was poorly phrased," Sullivan admitted with a smile. "I meant I'd be proud to have you on my arm to introduce you as—" He hesitated. "As what?" Virginia prompted, curious about how he would define their relationship. "As the woman I'm courting," Sullivan said firmly. "If that's agreeable to you." Virginia pretended to consider the proposition, though her heart was already racing with joy. "I suppose that would be acceptable, Mr. Kent," she replied primly, then broke into a grin at his momentarily concerned expression. Sullivan relaxed, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her hand. "You enjoy teasing me, don't you?" "Perhaps a little," Virginia admitted. "You make it too easy sometimes, being so serious." "I'm learning to be less so," Sullivan said, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that sent shivers up her arm. "You're a good teacher." Their eyes held, and Virginia felt the now familiar warmth that spread through her whenever Sullivan looked at her that way, as if she were precious and desired all at once. They had not yet shared more than the occasional touch of hands or a brief kiss on the cheek when saying good night, both aware of the propriety needed while Virginia lived under the main house roof and Emily was still recovering. "Speaking of teaching," Sullivan continued, reluctantly releasing her hand, "I've been thinking about what you told me about your father, how you assisted him with his medical practice." Virginia nodded, curious about this change of subject. "Yes, you have a gift, Virginia. The way you handled Miguel's injury, how you saved Emily and little James." Sullivan leaned forward, his expression earnest. "There's no doctor within 10 miles of the ranch. People around here have to travel to Grass Valley for medical care, which can be impossible in bad weather or emergencies." Virginia began to understand where he was leading. "Are you suggesting I should practice medicine here? In an informal capacity, at least," Sullivan confirmed. "The ranch hands already come to you with their minor ailments since the incident with Miguel. It seems natural to expand that role, maybe set aside a room in the main house as a kind of infirmary." Virginia was touched by his understanding of her passion for healing, something Frank had dismissed as inappropriate for a wife. "I'd like that very much. Though my knowledge is limited to what my father taught me, I'm not a trained doctor." "You know more than anyone else within miles," Sullivan pointed out. "And I could order medical books from San Francisco, supplies too. You could continue learning." The prospect was exciting, offering a purpose beyond her role as Emily's companion. "Thank you for suggesting it," Virginia said softly, "for seeing that part of me and valuing it." Sullivan's expression grew serious. "I see all of you, Virginia. Your compassion, your intelligence, your strength. It's why he stopped abruptly, seeming to reconsider his words. Virginia's heart stuttered. Had he been about to say what she thought, what she hoped? "Why you what?" she asked, barely breathing. Sullivan stood and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking both her hands in his. "It's why I've fallen in love with you," he said simply, his blue eyes steady on hers. "I didn't expect it, and I certainly don't deserve you after the circumstances that brought you here. But I love you, Virginia Edwards. And if you'll allow me the time to prove myself worthy, I hope one day you might consider becoming my wife." Virginia felt tears spring to her eyes at his declaration. It was more than she had dared to hope for, yet exactly what her heart had longed to hear. "Oh, Sullivan," she whispered. "You don't need to prove yourself worthy. You've shown me who you are every day since we met." "Is that a yes?" Sullivan asked, his voice rough with emotion. Virginia smiled through her tears. "It's a yes to allowing you to court me with marriage in mind. the rest. Let's give ourselves time to be certain, for Thomas's sake as well as our own. Sullivan nodded, understanding her caution. Time we have, he agreed, though not an unlimited supply if the gray hairs I found this morning are any indication. Virginia laughed, the joy bubbling up irrepressibly. You're hardly ancient at 29. Ancient enough to know what I want, Sullivan replied, his expression softening, and wise enough to know that the best things are worth waiting for. With that, he leaned forward and kissed her their first real kiss, gentle but full of promise. Virginia responded, her hands moving to cup his face as the warmth between them kindled into something deeper. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Sullivan rested his forehead against hers. I should say good night, he murmured, before I forget my resolve to court you properly. Virginia nodded reluctantly. Good night, Sullivan, and thank you for loving me. He pressed one more quick kiss to her lips before rising. Thank you for giving me a second chance at happiness. I never thought I'd find it again after Rebecca died. Nor I after Frank, Virginia admitted. Life has a way of surprising us. As Sullivan left the house, Virginia remained by the fire, her fingers touching her lips where his kiss still lingered. From the depths of despair on that auction block in Nevada City, to this moment of pure joy, the journey had been difficult, but the destination was proving to be worth every step. The winter months passed in a haze of quiet contentment at Willow Creek Ranch. Christmas was celebrated with more festivity than the ranch had seen in years, according to Emily, who was gradually regaining her strength. Sullivan and Virginia did indeed attend the social in Grass Valley, where Virginia was introduced to the neighboring ranchers and townspeople. As Sullivan Kent's special friend, a designation that raised a few eyebrows, but was generally met with approval. By February, Emily was well enough to resume most of her duties, and Virginia moved back to her cabin with Thomas, who was growing into a happy, robust baby. The separation from Sullivan each night was difficult after months of sharing late-night conversations in the main house, but their courtship continued to deepen, with Sullivan finding reasons to visit the cabin almost daily. In March, as the first signs of spring began to appear across the ranch, Sullivan formally proposed marriage during a picnic beside the creek that gave the ranch its name. Virginia, who had long since given her heart to the stern rancher with the compassionate soul, accepted without hesitation. They set the wedding date for June, allowing time for proper preparations, and for Virginia's position in the community to be firmly established beyond her initial role as Emily's companion. The news was greeted with enthusiasm by everyone at the ranch, especially Emily, who had been not so subtly encouraging the match for months. I knew from the moment Sullivan brought you here that you were exactly what he needed, she told Virginia as they planned the wedding details. Though I admit I didn't expect it to happen quite so quickly, Virginia smiled, thinking of how far they had come in less than a year. Life doesn't always follow the expected path. Thank goodness for that, Emily replied, bouncing little James on her knee. Otherwise, you might never have come to Willow Creek. The thought of never having found this happiness was sobering. Virginia had often reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought Sullivan to that auction yard in Nevada City at precisely the moment when she needed saving. If he had arrived an hour later or chosen a different route through town. What are you thinking about? Sullivan asked one evening in late April as they sat on the porch of Virginia's cabin, watching the sunset. Thomas was inside, already asleep after an active day of attempting to crawl. Virginia leaned her head against Sullivan's shoulder. How different everything might have been if you hadn't come to Nevada City that day. Sullivan's arm tightened around her. I try not to think about that. The idea of what might have happened to you and Thomas. He shook his head. It doesn't bear considering. Sometimes I wonder if it was just chance, or if there was something more guiding you there, Virginia mused. My father would have called it providence. Sullivan was quiet for a moment, contemplating. I wasn't even supposed to go to Nevada City that day, he finally said. Joe usually handles the supply runs, but he had injured his back the week before, and I nearly went to Sacramento instead, where the prices are better. But something. He paused. Something told me to go to Nevada City. Virginia lifted her head to look at him. You never told me that before. Sullivan shrugged slightly. It seemed like an insignificant detail, but maybe your father was right about Providence. He turned to face her fully. Whatever brought me there, I thank God every day that it did. Virginia reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. So do I. Sullivan caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I have something for you, he said, reaching into his pocket. I've been waiting for the right moment. He produced a small velvet box and opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant gold band set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was my mother's, Sullivan explained. My father gave it to her when they reached California and could finally marry legally. Virginia's breath caught at the significance of the gift. Sullivan, it's beautiful, but are you sure? It's such an important family heirloom. I've never been more sure of anything, he replied, taking the ring from its box. My mother would have loved you, Virginia. Your strength, your compassion, your willingness to forge your own path despite convention. She told me once to give this ring only to a woman who understood that love is an act of courage as much as of feeling. Tears filled Virginia's eyes as Sullivan slipped the ring onto her finger. I'll try to be worthy of it, she whispered. And of you. You already are, Sullivan assured her, drawing her into his arms. More than worthy. Their kiss deepened, filled with the promise of the life they would soon share officially. When they finally pulled apart, Virginia rested her forehead against Sullivan's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. 6 more weeks until the wedding, Sullivan murmured into her hair. It feels like an eternity. Virginia chuckled. After everything we've been through to get here, surely we can manage 6 weeks of propriety. Speak for yourself, Sullivan replied with a rueful smile. I'm finding it increasingly difficult to say goodnight and leave you here each evening. Virginia felt a blush warm her cheeks at his candor. Their courtship had been respectful but not without passion, and there had been moments when their kisses had threatened to lead to more. Just think how sweet our wedding night will be after all this anticipation, she teased. Sullivan groaned softly. You're not helping, Virginia. She laughed and stepped back from his embrace. Then perhaps we should say good night now before I tempt you further. Sullivan sighed dramatically but nodded. You're right, as usual. He picked up his hat from the porch railing where he had set it earlier. I'll see you tomorrow. Emily wants to discuss the wedding menu again. Again, Virginia rolled her eyes good-naturedly. She's more excited about this wedding than we are, I think. She's happy for us, Sullivan said simply, and so am I. He leaned in for one more quick kiss. Good night, my love. Good night, Virginia replied, watching as he walked toward the main house, his tall figure silhouetted against the last glow of sunset. Inside the cabin, Virginia checked on Thomas before preparing for bed. As she removed her engagement ring to wash her hands, she marveled again at its beauty and significance. That Sullivan would give her his mother's ring spoke volumes about his feelings and his commitment to their future together. As she slid beneath the covers, Virginia reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate young widow on an auction block to the soon-to-be wife of Sullivan Kent, mistress of Willow Creek Ranch, and with plans to establish a small infirmary to serve the surrounding area. It was a transformation she could never have imagined a year ago. Thomas stirred in his cradle, making the small snuffling sounds that usually preceded waking. Virginia rose to check on him, finding him blinking up at her in the dim light of the single candle she had left burning. "Hello, my darling," she whispered, lifting him into her arms. "Did you have a nice dream?" Thomas responded with a toothless smile that never failed to melt her heart. At 8 months, he was thriving, a happy, healthy boy with no knowledge of the circumstances of his birth or the early perils of his life. "In a few weeks, you'll have a new father," Virginia told him softly, settling in the rocking chair to nurse him back to sleep. "A good man who already loves you as his own." It was true. Sullivan had formed a deep bond with Thomas, spending time with him each day, clearly relishing the role of father-to-be. Virginia had worried initially that Sullivan might see Thomas as a reminder of her first marriage, but he had quickly dispelled that concern. "Thomas is part of you," he had told her when she cautiously raised the subject. "How could I not love him? Besides, he has your eyes and your determination. Frank Edwards may have contributed to his existence, but this boy is yours, Virginia, and soon he'll be ours." As Thomas drifted back to sleep in her arms, Virginia's thoughts turned to the future stretching before them. A future filled with love, family, purpose, everything she had once thought beyond her reach. The memory of that auction yard seemed increasingly distant, like a bad dream from which she had finally awakened. Yet Virginia knew she would never forget it entirely, nor would she want to. That terrible day had led her to Sullivan, to Willow Creek Ranch, to this life that was becoming more precious to her with each passing day. From the deepest despair had come her greatest joy, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could find a way to shine through. The June morning of Virginia Edwards' wedding to Sullivan Kent dawned clear and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and pine from the surrounding hills. In the guest room of the main house, where Virginia had spent the night according to tradition, Emily bustled about, helping the bride prepare while Maria tended to Thomas, now crawling energetically across the bed. "Hold still," Emily instructed, carefully pinning Virginia's hair into an elegant arrangement topped with a crown of white roses. "Sullivan will be speechless when he sees you." Virginia smiled nervously at her reflection in the mirror. The wedding dress, ordered from San Francisco at Sullivan's insistence, was more beautiful than anything she had ever owned. Made of ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, it hugged her figure before flaring gently from the waist in a cascade of fabric. "I can hardly believe this is happening," Virginia admitted, smoothing the silk over her lap. "A year ago I thought my life was over, and now—" Emily squeezed her shoulders gently. "And now you're about to marry my stubborn, wonderful brother and make him the happiest man in California." She placed the last pin in Virginia's hair and stepped back to admire her work. "There. Perfect." A knock at the door announced Maria's husband, Joe Callahan, who had agreed to walk Virginia down the aisle in the absence of any family of her own. "It's time, ladies," he called through the closed door. "The minister's arrived, and Sullivan is wearing a hole in the parlor floor with his pacing." Emily laughed. "Tell him we're coming. A bride is allowed to be a few minutes late, it's tradition." As Maria gathered Thomas, now handsomely dressed in a tiny suit that matched Sullivan's, Virginia took a final look in the mirror. The woman who gazed back at her seemed worlds away from the desperate widow who had stood trembling on an auction block less than a year ago. This woman's eyes held confidence, hope, and love, the reflection of a heart that had found its home. "Ready?" Emily asked softly, Virginia nodded, picking up the bouquet of wildflowers and roses that Josephina had gathered that morning. Ready. The ceremony was held in the large parlor of the main house, transformed for the occasion with white ribbons and flowers. A small group had gathered the ranch hands and their families, neighbors from surrounding ranches, and a few townspeople from Grass Valley who had become friends over the past months. As Virginia entered on Joe's arm, her eyes immediately found Sullivan, standing tall and handsome by the fireplace where the minister waited. His usually stern expression had given way to one of such naked adoration that Virginia felt her heart might burst with joy. Sullivan watched her approach, scarcely able to believe that this beautiful, remarkable woman was about to become his wife. When Joe placed Virginia's hand in his, Sullivan squeezed her fingers gently, trying to convey through that simple touch all the love he felt. The minister's words washed over them as they stood together, their eyes locked in a private communion that transcended the formal ceremony. When it came time for the vows, Sullivan's voice rang clear and strong through the room. "I, Sullivan James Kent, take you, Virginia Eleanor Edwards, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love, honor, and cherish you all the days of my life, to stand beside you in joy and in sorrow, in plenty and in want, in sickness and in health, to be your partner, your protector, and your friend from this day forward, until death parts us." Virginia's voice trembled slightly as she repeated her own vows, tears of happiness threatening to spill from her eyes. When Sullivan slid the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, she felt as if her heart might overflow with emotion. "By the authority vested in me by the state of California," the minister proclaimed, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Sullivan needed no further invitation. Drawing Virginia gently into his arms, he kissed her with a tenderness that belied the passion she knew. He felt a passion matched by her own. The room erupted in applause and cheers, led enthusiastically by Emily, and echoed by the ranch hands who had grown fond of Virginia during her months at Willow Creek. The celebration that followed was joyous and intimate, a feast prepared by Maria and Josephina, music provided by Ben Cooper on his fiddle, and dancing that continued well into the evening. Throughout it all, Sullivan kept Virginia close, his hand rarely leaving hers as they accepted congratulations and well wishes from their guests. As twilight descended, Sullivan whispered in Virginia's ear, "Shall we make our escape? The carriage is ready." Instead of spending their wedding night at the ranch, Sullivan had arranged for them to stay at the finest hotel in Grass Valley, leaving Thomas in the capable care of Emily and Maria. In the morning, they would board the train for a 2-week honeymoon in San Francisco, Virginia's first trip to the city since leaving Sacramento as Frank Edwards' bride years before. With fond farewells and promises to return soon, the newlyweds slipped away from the celebration. Sullivan handed Virginia into the waiting carriage, then joined her, instructing the driver to proceed to Grass Valley. As the carriage rolled away from the ranch, Sullivan drew Virginia into his arms. "Mrs. Kent," he murmured against her hair, "I've been waiting all day to call you that." Virginia smiled up at him, her heart full to bursting. "It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it?" "The nicest," Sullivan agreed, brushing his lips against hers. "Are you happy, Virginia?" "Happier than I ever thought possible," she assured him, resting her head against his shoulder as the carriage carried them toward their first night as husband and wife. "I still can't quite believe how much my life has changed since that day in Nevada City." Sullivan's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I was there to find you." His voice grew husky with emotion. "Do you remember what I said to you that day?" Virginia nodded against his chest. You said both of you deserve better. And now you have it, Sullivan said softly. A life where you're cherished, respected, loved, where Thomas will grow up knowing only kindness and security. We both have what we deserve now, Virginia corrected him gently. A true partnership, a family built on love. As the carriage continued its journey under a canopy of stars, Virginia reflected on the strange, beautiful path that had led her to this moment. From the depths of despair on that auction block to the heights of joy in Sullivan's arms, it was a journey she would never have chosen, yet one she could now look back on with gratitude for where it had ultimately led. The future stretched before them, bright with promise, a life at Willow Creek Ranch with Thomas and perhaps more children to come, Virginia's growing medical practice serving the community, Sullivan's continued success with the ranch. It would not always be easy. Life in the West never was. But they would face whatever came together, stronger for having found each other against all odds. And in the years to come, whenever Virginia would tell their remarkable love story to their children and eventually their grandchildren, she would always begin with the moment that changed everything, the moment when a tall, stern rancher carried a woman in labor away from an auction block, declaring simply, "Both of you deserve better." For in that moment of compassion and justice, a love story had begun that would endure through all the seasons of their lives, a testament to the power of second chances and the unexpected ways in which hearts find their way home. 3 years later, Virginia Kent stood on the porch of the main house at Willow Creek Ranch, watching as Sullivan guided a small pony around the yard with their son Thomas perched proudly on its back. At 4 years old, Thomas was the image of his mother, with the same determined spirit and compassionate heart that had first drawn Sullivan to Virginia. "Look, Mama," Thomas called excitedly. "I'm riding all by myself." Sullivan's hands remained firmly on both boy and pony, but Virginia smiled and waved encouragingly. "You're doing wonderfully, darling." From the rocking chair beside her, Emily laughed. "He's fearless, just like his mother." Virginia glanced fondly at her sister-in-law, who was watching her own 3 children playing a game of tag nearby. In the 3 years since Virginia and Sullivan's wedding, their bond had only deepened, forged through shared joys and challenges. "Fearless might be overstating it," Virginia demurred, placing a protective hand over her swollen belly where her and Sullivan's second child grew. At 7 months pregnant, she was feeling increasingly ungainly, but no less determined to continue her work in the small infirmary they had established in a converted outbuilding near the main house. What had begun as an informal medical service for the ranch hands had gradually expanded into a vital resource for the surrounding community. Word of Virginia's skill and compassion had spread, bringing patients from neighboring ranches and even from Grass Valley when the town's doctor was unavailable. Sullivan had fully supported her endeavors, ordering medical books and supplies from as far away as San Francisco and Boston, and even building an addition to the infirmary when the original space proved too small. His pride in Virginia's accomplishments was evident in the way he spoke of her to visitors, and in the tender care he took of her when she returned exhausted from a difficult case. Their marriage had deepened with each passing season, growing stronger through the inevitable challenges of life on a frontier ranch. There had been a devastating drought their first year together, a winter so harsh it claimed some of their livestock, and the constant small crises that came with managing a large property. Through it all, they had remained partners in the truest sense, facing each obstacle together with the same determination that had brought them through their initial trials. "Pa, watch me," Thomas called, drawing Virginia's attention back to the yard where Sullivan was now letting the boy hold the reins himself, though his large hands remained close by. "I'm watching, son," Sullivan replied, his voice filled with the pride and love that never failed to warm Virginia's heart. The bond between Sullivan and Thomas had been immediate and unwavering, with no distinction ever made between the boy born to another man and the child Sullivan and Virginia expected in the coming months. As if sensing her thoughts, the baby within her gave a strong kick. Virginia smiled, rubbing the spot gently. Sullivan was hoping for a daughter this time, though he insisted he would be equally delighted with another son. "Your young patients were asking after you yesterday," Emily remarked, referring to the Wilson children whom Virginia had treated for influenza the previous week. "Their mother says they're fully recovered thanks to your care." Virginia nodded, pleased. "I'm glad to hear it. That new remedy from Dr. Parker's medical journal seems to be effective." Her correspondence with physicians in larger cities had been another unexpected development of her medical practice. Sullivan had encouraged her to write to doctors in San Francisco and Sacramento, sharing her experiences treating frontier ailments and seeking advice on cases beyond her expertise. To her surprise, several had responded with respect rather than condescension, recognizing the value of her practical knowledge even without formal training. "You've done more good in these 3 years than most people manage in a lifetime," Emily observed. "Sullivan was right about your gift for healing." Virginia smiled, acknowledging the compliment. "It's a blessing to be able to help, and to have the support to do so." The contrast with her first marriage, where Frank had belittled her medical knowledge and forbidden her from using it, could not have been starker. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention to the road leading to the ranch. A rider was approaching at speed, and Virginia recognized Ben Cooper, now the assistant foreman, returning from a supply run to Grass Valley. Sullivan handed Thomas's pony to one of the younger ranch hands and strode to meet Ben, who was already dismounting. Whatever news Ben delivered caused Sullivan to straighten and look toward the house with an expression Virginia had learned to recognize concern mixed with determination. "Something's happened," she murmured, rising from her chair as Sullivan made his way to the porch. "Virginia," he called as he approached, "there's been an accident at the Richardson place. Their barn collapsed while they were repairing the roof. Ben says there are several injured." Virginia was already moving, her mind shifting to the preparations needed. "How many? How serious?" "At least 3 men, 1 critical according to the rider who came for help." Sullivan followed her into the house. "I'll hitch the wagon while you gather your supplies." Emily rose as well. "I'll help, and I'll look after Thomas until you return." Virginia squeezed her sister-in-law's hand gratefully before hurrying to the infirmary. Within minutes, she had assembled her medical bag with bandages, suture materials, laudanum for pain, and the various instruments she might need. Sullivan appeared at the door, having given instructions to the ranch hands and explained to Thomas why his riding lesson needed to end early. "The wagon's ready," he announced. "Maria's packing food. We don't know how long we'll be." Virginia nodded, adding a few more items to her bag. "Thank you for coming with me." Sullivan's expression softened as he briefly placed a hand on her shoulder. "Always, though I wish you'd rest more in your condition." Virginia gave him a look that he knew well, determination mixed with a touch of stubbornness. "The baby and I are fine. These people need help that I can provide." Sullivan knew better than to argue. Instead, he picked up her medical bag and offered his other arm for support. "Then let's go, Dr. Kent." The title was his private endearment for her, acknowledging the role she had come to fill in their community, despite her lack of formal credentials. It never failed to make her smile, even in tense moments like this. The journey to the Richardson Ranch took just over an hour, with Sullivan handling the wagon with the skill of a man who had spent his life on horseback and in vehicles of all sorts. As they approached, they could see the collapsed barn and the group of people gathered around several prone figures on the ground. Virginia was already mentally preparing for what she would find. Sullivan helped her down from the wagon with careful hands, then carried her medical bag as they approached the scene. "Mrs. Kent, thank God you've come," Jacob Richardson called, hurrying to meet them. His shirt was bloodied and a gash on his forehead had been hastily bandaged. "It's my son William and two of our hands. The roof gave way without warning." Virginia moved immediately to the injured men, Sullivan a steady presence beside her. For the next several hours, she worked tirelessly setting broken bones, stitching wounds, administering pain medication, and finally determining that while all three men were seriously injured, none appeared to be in immediate danger of death if properly cared for. William Richardson, the most severely injured with a broken leg and several cracked ribs, would need to be transported to Grass Valley for the town doctor to treat, as his injuries required more expertise than Virginia felt comfortable providing. The other two men could recover at the Richardson Ranch under her instructions. Throughout the ordeal, Sullivan remained at her side, anticipating her needs, providing physical support when she needed to move injured men, and quietly ensuring she took moments to rest and drink water. His concern for her and their unborn child was evident in the protective way he positioned himself, whenever the work required Virginia to kneel or bend, ready to assist her in rising again. By the time they were ready to depart, the sun was setting. Virginia was exhausted but satisfied that she had done all she could for the injured men. Sullivan insisted on making one more check of her patience before helping her back into the wagon for the journey home. "You're incredible," he told her softly as they rode back to Willow Creek in the gathering darkness. "I watched you today and thought again how fortunate we all are to have you here." Virginia leaned against his shoulder, fatigue washing over her now that the immediate crisis had passed. "I'm the fortunate one," she murmured. "To have found a place where I can use the knowledge my father gave me, to have a husband who supports me rather than constrains me." Sullivan wrapped one arm around her, keeping the other on the reins. "I would never seek to constrain any part of who you are, Virginia. It would be like trying to capture sunlight." The poetic words, so unlike Sullivan's usual practical speech, made her smile despite her tiredness. "You've been reading Emily's novels again, haven't you?" He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her ear. "Perhaps one or two. A man can learn a thing or two about romancing his wife from such books." "You don't need lessons in romancing me," Virginia assured him, tilting her face up to his in the moonlight. "You won my heart long ago." Sullivan leaned down to kiss her briefly, still mindful of his responsibility to guide the wagon safely home. "And I intend to keep winning it every day for the rest of our lives." As they approached Willow Creek Ranch, the lights of the main house glowing warmly in the distance, Virginia reflected again on the journey that had brought her here. From the desperate woman on an auction block to the respected healer and beloved wife she had become, it was a transformation that still sometimes seemed miraculous. Yet it had not been a miracle, but rather the courage of one man to stand against injustice and her own determination to build a new life from the ashes of the old. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting: a family, a home, a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. As Sullivan guided the wagon into the yard, where Emily waited anxiously on the porch with Thomas half asleep in her arms. Virginia felt the familiar sense of homecoming that never failed to fill her heart with gratitude. Whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, she would face them here, surrounded by love and purpose, in the place and with the people who had given her a second chance at happiness. "Welcome home, Mrs. Kent," Sullivan murmured as he helped her down from the wagon with gentle hands. "Both of you." Virginia smiled up at him, her hand joining his over the child they had created together. "Home," she agreed softly, "the most beautiful word in any language." And as they walked together toward the warmth and light of the house, Virginia knew with absolute certainty that Sullivan had been right that fateful day in Nevada City. They had deserved better, and together they had found it.